The Select Committee will come to order. The clerk will play a video.
Of Ukraine, the largest invasion of a neighboring country in Europe since World War II.
Hamas has launched a surprise attack within Israel's borders overnight.
Iran gives up to $100 million a year to Hamas.
Xi Jinping says Taiwan will be reunified with China during his New Year's address.
So 2024 must mark an inflection point. We stand at this crossroads, whether to surrender to a sea of troubles or do everything we can to deter.
The growing number of world conflicts and threats have strengthened ties between Moscow and Beijing,
Pledging to shape a new world order.
Xi told Putin that they are driving changes not seen in a century and will provide an alternative to Western influence.
Ibrahim Raisi's visit comes as both China and Iran strengthen their relationships with Russia. Both sides say they're opposed to a world order led by the United States and its allies.
China is by far the most serious challenge to U.S. national security, with the power to reshape the international order to Beijing's liking.
Both the People's Republic of China and Russia have the means to threaten our interests and our way of life.
We're the last real superpower, and now China is a near peer-to-peer adversary to us now. And of course their goal is to rebuild the empire. They're even putting outposts around us. They're buying up farmland in states here in the US. And even in some of these localities, we have Chinese CCP-owned companies that are coming in and open shop on Main Street.
An age of idealism has been replaced by a period of hard-headed realism. Old enemies are reanimated, new foes are taking shape, battle lines are being redrawn.
Russia is gathering its forces as it attempts to break Ukrainian defenses across the eastern Donetsk region. Russia is also receiving support from Iran. Ukrainian officials say Moscow has used hundreds of Iranian drones to hit civilian and military targets. And then there's China. The records show that Chinese state-owned companies provided Russian government-owned defense firms with navigation equipment, jamming technology, and jet fighter pods.
Iran has increasingly turned its sights toward China.
China is Iran's biggest trading partner and the only customer of its heavily sanctioned oil exports. Plans made under a 25-year strategic agreement signed in 2021.
According to the New York Times, the agreement calls for joint training and exercises, joint research and weapons development, and intelligence sharing.
And actively deepen defense cooperation with new member Iran.
Iran-backed groups form a land bridge across the Middle East and connect in an alliance that Tehran calls the axis of resistance.
Russian or Chinese firearms, relics from previous wars that made their way into the hands of Hamas.
The foundation of the world order being shaken to their core. To guarantee our freedoms, we must be prepared to deter.
And as we work in concert to meet the authentic problems of our time, we will generate a vision and an energy which will demonstrate anew to the world the superior vitality and the strength of the free society.
Well, thank you. First, a point of order. We have a hard stop at 11, so I'm going to be ruthless in enforcing time limits, beginning with my own. I had a fancy prepared speech, but instead I'd like to tell a story that Secretary Panetta has heard me tell before, which is that when I was a freshman member of Congress with the Secretary's son, Jimmy, we had a meeting of the Problem Solvers Caucus, and we were listening to his wisdom, and I piped up and I said, Mr. Secretary, what was the best job you ever had in Washington, D.C.? And in a response that would simultaneously inspire and depress me, he said, the best job I ever had was being a member of Congress. He was a man who had had every great job in Washington, D.C., and he said the best job he ever had was as a member of Congress because, and I quote him, there was a feeling you could get stuff done. And I'd like to think that at a time when Congress is struggling to get much done, this committee has been an oasis of bipartisanship and at least an attempt to reinvigorate that spirit and that feeling that Secretary Panetta was talking about. We have two incredible public servants with us today, Secretary Pompeo as well, to provide their perspective on how we restore deterrence and meet the moment. And we are in a decisive moment for U.S. national security, for global security more broadly. Famously, Churchill called the period of German rearmament and alliance building the gathering storm. Today, the storm gathers once more, and as we watch China undertake the largest peacetime military buildup since at least World War II, and it finds eager friends in Tehran, Moscow, and Pyongyang, we should reflect on the lessons of history. Problems, this is true in your personal life as much as it is in geopolitics, problems do not age well. We ignore them at our peril. Appeasement or over-reliance on polite diplomacy cannot save us. We must act decisively to enhance our military strength, support our allies, and deter this authoritarian alignment. Only strength will be able to withstand the storm. I now recognize the ranking member, Raja Krishnamurthy, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming, the distinguished secretaries who are with us today. Until the last few years, a lot of Americans thought that freedom and democracy were finally spreading around the world. After the Cold War, democracy spread from Eastern Europe to East Asia to Sub-Saharan Africa. In the 1990s, some pundits theorized that in addition to the spread of democracy, growing economic ties between countries would also make war less likely. In fact, there was even a theory that it would be impossible for two countries that both had McDonald's to go to war with each other. This was called, and I'm not kidding, this was called, quote, the Golden Arches theory of conflict prevention. And it would look something like this. As you can see in this picture, you can see the Golden Arches, and there's Ronald McDonald conquering the battlefield. Instead of swords being beaten into plowshares, tanks are traded in for, yes, Happy Meals. I like this theory a lot. One reason is that McDonald's is based in my home state of Illinois. And the other reason is that McDonald's was my first real job in life, flipping burgers. So I have a sentimental attachment to this theory. But there's only one thing wrong with this theory, and that is it's false. It doesn't work. Because while the Chinese Communist Party invited McDonald's into China, the CCP did not trade in its tanks for Happy Meals. Instead, in 1989, they sent those tanks into Tiananmen Square, just a few blocks from what would be the largest McDonald's in the world. Vladimir Putin didn't trade in his tanks either and sent them into Ukraine 2 years ago. When McDonald's stopped operating in Russia in protest, Putin forced a sale of McDonald's property and renamed their brand. You can't go to McDonald's in Moscow anymore, but you can go to this place. It's called Vkusna i Tochka, Russian for tasty, and that's it. Economic ties with the CCP and Russia did not lead them to become democracies or to become more peaceful. In fact, the opposite happened. After coming to power, Xi Jinping issued document number 9, which tells the CCP to stamp out, quote, false ideological trends like democracy, universal values, media independence, and civil society. The CCP now jails, disappears, and murders journalists and dissidents, and it's carrying out an ongoing genocide, a genocide against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang province. Beyond its borders, the CCP militarized the South China Sea, and it's increasing its military threat in Taiwan. Xi Jinping declared a, quote, no-limits partnership with Vladimir Putin, and now stands by the Putin regime during its brutal invasion in Ukraine. Last October, President Biden sent Congress a request for additional funding to support Ukraine and others who are defending freedom and democracy against those who wish to tear down these ideals. In November, every single Democrat on this committee signed a letter to congressional leadership urging this body to take action to pass that supplemental funding request. It's now January. The time to pass President Biden's supplemental funding request is now. It's now. The spread of freedom and democracy around the world has been one of recent history's most extraordinary developments. The power of these ideals has been proven by how fiercely those who enjoy them will fight to protect them. Rather than turning their swords into plowshares as they've integrated with the world economy, the CCP and Putin's Russia have bought more swords. Consequently, we must acquire more shields. And we must help our friends shield their democracies from attack as well. Our mutual security depends on it. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the ranking member, and I know for the record that your chart and prop game gets better every time we do a hearing. Very impressive. Again, we're privileged to have two public servants, two former secretaries. Secretary Pompeo was Secretary of State and CIA Director during the Trump administration. He also served the 4th District of Kansas in Congress from 2011 to 2017. Secretary Pompeo was the Director of the CIA, as well as the Secretary of Defense under President Barack Obama. He had previously served as Chief of Staff for former President Bill Clinton, and in what was his best job, apparently, as a member of Congress from California from 1977 to 1993. We thank both of you for making time out of your busy schedules to be here. If you could please stand and raise your right hand, I will now swear you in. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. Thank you. Secretary Pompeo, you are recognized for your opening remarks.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Krishnamurti. It's great to be here. Started my career at Canon 107, so it feels like home very much. It's a real privilege to be in front of this particular committee. You all are doing important, remarkable, bipartisan work, and I want to personally, on behalf of the Pompeo family, thank you, each of you, for doing that. It matters to my family, it matters to each American, and bless you for that. You all have in front of you, much like I did in my time in Congress, important decisions. We have wars raging in Europe, in the Middle East. There's risk of one in South America, much closer to home even. And of course, the topic we're here today to talk about, the challenges in the Pacific and Asia, are in front of us as well. I know that you will endeavor to get these decisions right. To start, I always try to get to the facts. I'm going to try and do this in just 3 minutes. We've got deterrence lost in Europe. We have deterrence lost in the Middle East. We are on the cusp of losing that very deterrent model in Asia as well. One could argue that elements of that have already been lost. Chairman Kim, who I spent way too much time with, Chairman Kim has now talked about the absence of any desire for peaceful reunification with the Republic of Korea. That is a change that is important. I was in Guyana 2 weeks ago. They are frightened by Maduro and his efforts to retake, in his words, much as Xi Jinping talks about reunifying, retake what is rightfully theirs. This is a challenge that is linked. It's not just about one of these theaters, one of these zones, one of these regions, but these are all deeply linked to whether America will have the resolve, determination, and capacity to deter and maintain the order that we have benefited, that Americans have benefited from since the post-Cold War order was established. We know that this conflict largely begins with economics. Chinese Communist Party has been at war with the United States economy for at least 20 years, one could argue 40. It might well have made sense for the esteemed Dr. Kissinger to go and travel and open up relationships with the Chinese Communist Party back in 1972. It might have made sense in 1982. It made no sense by 2002, 2012, and certainly today makes no sense. It's dangerous for the United States to allow the Chinese Communist Party to have engaged here at home in ways that undermine the very foundations of our republic. And I know I'll get asked about this today, but I think it's important that when we think of the challenge from the Chinese Communist Party, we think not only about Taiwan, not only about the South Pacific and about the First Island chain, but about Los Angeles and Denver and Washington, D.C., and Chicago and my home state of Kansas. The Chinese Communist Party is working diligently inside the gates to undermine everything it is that we stand for. When he talks about American decline, he is not doing so passively. He is an advocate. He is working to achieve that very American decline here at home. And the last thought, Secretary Panetta, it is great to be with you here today, and I think it's important for America to see that this challenge is not remotely about politics. It is not remotely partisan. It is so much more fundamental than that. I have been critical of many of President Biden's foreign policy actions, but I must say the work that they continue to do to confront the challenge of China, I have approved and appreciated. I always knew that we could do more. They could do more as well, and I'm counting on this committee to help us get to that place. When we put sanctions in place, we can't immediately turn around and create loopholes. When we put in place economic orders that suggest how America ought to proceed, we cannot let our adversaries, whether they be from Russia, escape those sanctions regime, and we have to make sure that our friends comply with them as well. This will require temerity from each of us. The Chinese Communist Party is not about to give in because of some great speech that someone gives, some set of wonderful remarks, or a set of meetings held in San Francisco or Beijing or Washington, D.C. They are determined. They will push back against our actions, and we need to make sure that we hold the Chinese Communist Party at risk in the same way that they seek to put America at risk each day. If we get that piece right, the tactics, the operational pieces, we'll get those. A strong United States military, capable diplomatic corps, and a robust American economy can deliver those outcomes in a way that will give us the chance that 250 years from now, the 76th or 79th Secretary of State can sit here with his Democrat counterpart from a previous administration and still have the opportunity to defend what we hold most sacred. Thanks for giving me the chance to be with you all today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for those great remarks. Secretary Panetta, you are now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Distinguished members of the committee, thanks for inviting me to testify on the increasing threat posed by the People's Republic of China and its ongoing efforts to undermine the United States and allied interests around the world. And thank you for having me join with my good friend, Mike Pompeo, who we worked together when he was in my job as director of the CIA, and continued to be in touch during the time he was Secretary of State. And Mike and I are good friends, and I'm glad that we are here to be able to present our views. I also want to thank this committee. The fact that you are a bipartisan committee working on this issue is incredibly important to our foreign policy. And I want to commend you for the work that you've done, and particularly the report you issued on economic competition. Look, we live in a dangerous world in which tyrants and autocrats and terrorists are challenging and attacking democracies. And so they're threatening our values, they're threatening our interests and our national security. When Putin brutally invaded Ukraine, it was for no other reason but that he did not believe the people of Ukraine had the right to decide how to govern themselves. I believe Ukraine is fighting not just to protect their democracy, but to protect the concept of democracy in the 21st century. When Hamas attacked and brutally killed innocent men, women, and children in Israel, they, like Al-Qaeda on 9/11, made clear that they had no regard for the dignity of life. And Hamas's leadership does need to be destroyed, just as we targeted and destroyed Al-Qaeda leadership. We are facing an aligned group of dictators and autocrats from around the world, united in their determination to undermine our democracy. China is exploiting these conflicts to advance its own narrative of Western decline. She explicitly said the East is rising and the West is declining, and that China will replace the United States as a world power. I've met with Xi multiple times during the time I was in office, here and in Beijing. He's smart, he can be very diplomatic, he's committed to an aggressive China. But it is important that we never underestimate Xi Jinping, because he will use every opportunity to undermine the stability of the United States and the West. He will steal our intellectual property, conduct economic espionage, have extensive intelligence. I believe they've planted malware within our own computer networks. He will use artificial intelligence for disinformation campaigns. He will continue to militarize the South China Sea. He will modernize the People's Liberation Army, They have the largest Navy. They're producing large numbers of manned and unmanned aircraft, ICBMs. They're expanding their nuclear arsenal. They have 500 warheads, and they hope to double that by the end of the decade. As a result, they are not simply developing what could be called a general purpose military. They're developing a military that can employ the threat and the use of force. Xi Jinping recently said the reunification of the motherland is a historical necessity. And so there's no question they threaten Taiwan. The president was correct to say that we will defend Taiwan militarily if it comes to that. I have always believed strongly that when the U.S. gives its word, it must stand by its word. That is the essence of deterrence. The bottom line is we are facing an increasingly aligned group of autocrats around the world. And the fact is that they are now having dual-use technologies that are being spread with Russia, Iran, China, and North Korea. While this alignment of autocrats is troubling, the good news is that it does not even come close to approaching the strength and depth and breadth of the United States' global network of allies and partners. Look, some have suggested that our relationship with China is improving, and there's no question we've had increased military and economic dialogue. But make no mistake, the only way to try to avoid war with China, the only way to deal with China is from strength. From strength. Both China and Russia became more aggressive when they sensed weakness on the part of the U.S. And for that reason, we must take strong action to arm and train Taiwan to defend itself, to strengthen our force posture, to invest in the next generation of military technology, to bolster our alliances, and to maintain strong export controls on critical technologies. And I must say, we must demonstrate that our democracy is strong and that we can govern. For that reason, it is incredibly important that this Congress pass the supplemental request and provide necessary military aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. To fail would send a terrible message of weakness to adversaries and allies alike. We'll be playing China's game. And let me make clear that those who believe the United States can simply back away from our commitment in Ukraine, you cannot be weak on Ukraine and be tough on China. In conclusion, let me just say, I tell the students at the Panetta Institute that in our democracy we govern either by leadership or by crisis. If we fail to provide leadership, then we will govern by crisis. And the price of that is the loss of the trust of the American people in our democracy. This committee provides hope that we can govern and work together in a real sense. Our democracy and our national security depend on each of you for your leadership necessary to govern and protect our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. We've released 3 major policy reports that were the culmination of a year's worth of work, investigations, hearings, and member input. We're now trying to turn those into legislative reality. But I think perhaps the most important function of the committee is to try and explain to our colleagues and the American people why any of this matters. And for those who are in the DC Beltway, certainly those who work at think tanks, it may seem obvious why the defense of Taiwan or the genocide in Xinjiang matters, but I'm not sure it's as obvious to Americans who are just trying to live their lives. For example, I had 600 people come to a town hall in my district to talk about the lake sturgeon being listed as an endangered species, a huge issue for Northeast Wisconsin. I'm not sure I could get 20 people to come for a discussion about China. So I'd like to give both of you the opportunity to sort of answer for that everyday American who you've represented in your past job. Why does this matter? Why should they care about the threat posed by the CCP? And I'll start with you, Secretary Pompeo.
You know, Chairman Gallagher, it doesn't surprise me that you think that it might not be of as much interest to your constituents. I would describe this differently. I don't think these are two separate things. I'll hear people say, well, this is domestic policy and this is foreign policy. Today they are so deeply interconnected. What happens in Kyiv doesn't stay there. What happens in Gaza doesn't stay there. These threats are real. We can see it on our southern border as well, right? There are bad actors trying to infiltrate our nation across that border as well. And then for the folks back in Kansas, so many American jobs depend on the fact that we will confront the Chinese Communist Party's efforts to destroy our manufacturing base, to steal our intellectual property. There are real economic outcomes for ordinary families all across America that depend on a United States that is prepared to defend its own economy, to create the rule of law, to have trade lanes open, all of these things that somehow seem distant, they're right on top of us. Last piece, I talked about China inside the gates. You know, we closed in the Trump administration the Chinese consulate in Houston, Texas. We didn't close it because we disliked them. We closed it because they were conducting what I believe is one of the largest espionage operations ever against the American people from that very facility. They're in our universities today, operating to steal our finest high-end research. These things matter to American economic growth for years in front of us. And if we get it wrong, then our children and grandchildren will live in America that looks fundamentally different. We can't permit that to happen. And so it is not about something 6,000 miles away. It is about something just down the street for you, your family, and your neighbors.
Thank you, sir. Secretary Panetta, why does it matter in Monterey?
It matters because it really is about the fundamental security of our country. And I think one of the things that marks the American people is not just their common sense and their spirit and their resilience, but it's also their willingness to secure not just their family, but their country. As Secretary of Defense, I had the opportunity to look into the eyes of our men and women in uniform. At that time, going to both Iraq and Afghanistan. And what I saw was a willingness on the part of these young men and women to put their lives on the line in order to fight and die for this country. To fight and die for this country. And so there are men and women from across this country who have assumed the responsibility of providing security and putting their lives on the line in order to defend this country. So it is incredibly important to what I call the American dream. I'm the son of Italian immigrants. I used to ask my parents, why did you come to this country? They came in the early 30s. They came from a poor area in Italy. And I never forgot my father's response. He said, your mother and I believe we could give our children a better life in this country. I think that's the American dream, giving our children a better life. And that's what this is all about. If we don't provide security for this country, if we don't deal with the threats that we're facing abroad, then we are not providing security. We are not providing the American dream for our children.
Thank you, sir. I yield my 1 second. The ranking member is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Panetta, you eloquently stated your strong support for the White House's supplemental request for Ukraine assistance. Secretary Pompeo, you're also a very eloquent and strong supporter of aid to Ukraine. And as you laid out in a recent op-ed, it appears that part of your reasoning is that Putin winning in Ukraine would embolden the CCP and make a war over Taiwan more likely. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct. And Secretary Panetta spoke to that as well.
So let's just be very clear. If we do not further fund Ukraine now, war is more likely over Taiwan, which none of us want war over Taiwan or with China, and that's certainly what the American people do not want. Let me turn to my next topic. This is a picture of the CIA memorial wall honoring those who died in the line of duty. Last year, the CCP's secret police launched a recruitment campaign. They posted this picture with an article about the first CIA officer killed in the line of duty, whom the CCP claims they killed in Tibet in 1950. Now here's the rub. If you look at this article, the headline reads, quote, "The first black star the CIA hung on the stone wall is related to China," exclamation point. Now, Secretary Panetta, I find this very disturbing. Nobody should glorify the killing of an American. Do you agree?
Absolutely.
And Chairman Xi came to San Francisco recently and told us that he wants to, quote, "make friends with us." But Secretary Panetta, this might be obvious, but friends don't glorify or laud the killing of each other's people, right?
Absolutely.
I think that this is yet another example of the need to always judge the CCP by their actions, not necessarily just their words. Let me turn to this other very interesting picture, and Secretary Panetta, you might recognize this. Secretary Panetta, this is you in the PRC in 2012, and it looks like you're receiving a very memorable gift from China's then Minister of National Defense, General Liang. Do you remember this episode?
I remember very well.
Is this hung in your dining room, by the way?
I don't know if I've ever brought that photograph with me.
Now, interestingly, not only is that plate very memorable, but this gentleman here, General Liang, was actually the last defense minister in China to not be prosecuted for corruption. The next 3 individuals to hold this position as Minister of Defense were all prosecuted for corruption and or purged, and many others in the People's Liberation Army have also been purged. Secretary Panetta, there have been numerous reports of Xi Jinping purging some leaders not because of corruption, but because they disagree with Xi's leadership. So here's my question. Can you rule out that Xi Jinping is purging people from the PLA because they disagree with his leadership?
You know, that defense minister that I met with, actually, we established a pretty good relationship in our ability to talk to one another. And as a matter of fact, we began to do military exercises together and continue to have a dialogue. And I was hopeful at that time that we could continue that relationship. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. And you've just indicated the amount of corruption and those that are being dismissed because Xi doesn't particularly like the way they conduct business. What that does is it undermines stability in China, and it undermines stability in the military.
Yeah.
The fact that we broke down our communication with China here is of concern because we need to be able to stay in touch with China when we have differences of one kind or another. I think the answer to your question is that Xi, by virtue of the way he's dealing with his military leadership, I think is undermining their ability to respond effectively to what they need to do.
Let me turn to my last topic. This is a picture of Joshua Wong. Secretary Pompeo, Joshua Wong is a prisoner because he led pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. He came to the consulate in Hong Kong and requested refuge in 2020. When you were secretary, were you personally in favor of him receiving refuge?
Look, I don't want to talk about the discussions we had inside. I think the United States can always do more, whether it's for him, Nathan Law, Jimmy Lai, who's now being prosecuted. The United States can do more and do better to protect these people and their capacity to just do the basic things that every human being is entitled to speak their mind peaceably.
I call upon the CCP to release Joshua Wong, and I wish that we had provided him refuge at the time. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Luchtemeier is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank both Secretary Panetta and Pompeo for your fine service to our country. We certainly appreciate it. Secretary Pompeo, in your written testimony today, you talk about a couple different things. deal with the difficulties that the Chinese economy is having right now. Demographically, they're struggling. You talk about their stock market as a disaster. They're stealing money out of state-owned offshore accounts. But he says, make no mistake, a weakened China is an ever-growing danger to the United States and the world. So are you saying there, or do you just elaborate a little bit on this, that the weaker their economy is, the more volatile their government could be and the more danger they are to the rest of the world?
It's good to see you again.
Yes, great to see you too, sir.
It's not a direct line, that it is not a one-for-one. As they weaken, they present more risk. I think they present real risk no matter whether their economy is thriving in any given year or not. It is the case that the decision-making apparatus, and Secretary Panetta spoke to this, as there is more turmoil, as their economy struggles more, as they see the demographic handwriting on the wall, that the decision-making process inside of the Chinese Communist Party's leadership becomes more fractured. And as Xi Jinping sees the end of his time in leadership approaching as each day goes on, he is more likely to try and achieve the end game that he has described. He has been unambiguous about his objectives, that he is determined to do it during his time. And so I do think that as these challenges present themselves, there is always a risk that Xi Jinping will see the clock has run, and if America is not prepared to deter him, he'll be more likely to take action that is adverse to U.S. economic and U.S. military interests in the region.
Thank you. Secretary Panetta, you talked a while ago about dealing from strength. I'm assuming it also means economic strength, because as Secretary Pompeo indicated here, even if they're weakened, they're still dangerous. And in some of the testimony we've had before from some of our witnesses who have been refugees from China, they talk about the fact that they spend about $300 billion a year to surveil, detain, and build new detention camps on their own people. And in doing that, they have a tremendous fear of their own people, the government does, of their own people. So therefore, if you stress them, if you stress their economy, there are some difficulties. And we ourselves, to be able to offset that, have to have a strong economy. Would you agree with that? Would you like to speak to that, elaborate a little bit more?
Look, I think there's the whole thrust of our efforts with China is deterrence. And that deterrence has to be both military and economic. And I think the reality is that right now, because China has a very unpredictable economy, you just read today where their real estate industry is being challenged. They're in trouble because of loans that were issued, and the real estate area is a huge investment area for China. So they're going to suffer another hit as a result of that. And add to that the other unpredictability of the Chinese economy right now and the low growth that's taking place. I think what that's doing in some ways is it's drawing Xi's attention to what he was primarily concerned about, which was developing China as an economic power for the future. So in some ways, their problems represent good news for the United States.
Thank you. Secretary Pompeo, we're decoupling ourselves from China, and all the trade that we have has always been discussed on this committee. Should we do it at all? Should we do some? Should we do none? How should we approach that? And so I think we've had discussions. I sit on the Financial Services Committee along with Mr. Barr, and I chair the Subcommittee on National Security and International Finance. And so the trade and international financing of all these things all fits in together here. And so decoupling, I've only got about a half a minute left here, decoupling ourselves from China. What would your opinion be on doing that? To do it halfway, not at all? What would you suggest?
So difficult to do in 15 seconds, but let me give it a run.
First,
good, we should never for a moment think that we're going to get the decision on this. It could be the Chinese Communist Party makes decisions about the extent of that decoupling as well. That is, Xi Jinping gets a role in deciding how much trade there will be and on what terms. The most important thing we can do is make sure to protect the high-end dual-use materials. This should be the place we should focus intensely in the near term, and we should shut not just part of it down, but all of it down. As for the beach balls and blankets and the like, a more complicated problem set, and it is a continuum, but the effort today has to be to protect the crown jewels of the American economy and make sure that we have the resources that we need to continue to deliver American manufacturing across the world.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Castor.
Good morning. Secretary Panetta, in 2022, after Vladimir Putin and Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States, President Biden, and our NATO allies helped rally freedom-loving people across the globe to support Ukraine. What do you surmise Xi Jinping and the PRC took from that? What lesson did they take from the swiftness of that coalition?
As I mentioned in my testimony, I really do think that Russia and China grew more aggressive because they sensed a weakness on the part of the United States, that the United States was withdrawing from leadership in the world, was withdrawing from our alliances, and wasn't drawing the line on aggression. And I'm thankful that President Biden and our NATO allies drew a line on Putin. I don't think Putin expected that, very frankly. So it was really important for the United States and our allies to be able to say, if you cross that line, we will take steps to go after Russia. We'll undermine your economy, we'll provide military aid, and we will strengthen NATO. That was a clear message. And most importantly, the message was that the Ukrainians, because they were brave fighters, stopped the Russian invasion. That got the attention of Xi Jinping. And the fact that that invasion was stopped, the fact that the United States and our allies came together to help Ukraine, has been a major signal, I think, to Xi to think twice about Taiwan.
Because around that time, Putin and Xi said that there are no limits to this deepening relationship. They wanted to convey that publicly, to send a message to the rest of the world. And I think that's correct. The swiftness of the coalition, the robustness of it sent a message to China and Xi. But now it seems like they're waiting for the next election this year, that they're kind of hedging that there's going to be a change in policy. And they see that the Congress has not been able to pass a supplemental to bolster the Ukrainian people. What is Xi Jinping and the PRC taking from the fact that the Congress is yet not united in continuing to repel this foreign aggression from Putin?
Look, I believe, as Mike Mullen has said, that dysfunction in Washington is a threat to our national security. Because our ability to govern, our ability to work together, our ability to deal with the problems in this country, that's what democracy is all about. That's the strength of democracy, is the ability of Republicans and Democrats to sit down and to get things done, to provide the supplemental requests, to deal with defense issues, to deal with foreign policy issues. And when, for whatever reason, that breaks down and it doesn't work, what it does is it sends a signal to the world that the United States is not strong in our democracy, and that because of the dysfunction that we see in Washington, it is undermining our credibility in the world. So I can't tell you how important it is for the United States, for Republicans and Democrats to work together as this committee is, to basically send a signal that we are unified when it comes to defending our interests.
And for Xi Jinping in particular, what do you surmise that they're considering right now as the U.S. does not follow through with the help to democracies and the Ukrainian people in particular?
Xi is very aware of what's happening with regards to our country, just as Putin is. And when they see dysfunction, when they see that we can't get our act together to be able to do what's right, then they sense that that's weakness, and it gives them the incentive to think that, given the opportunity, they can take advantage of that. So what we're doing, by failing to pass the supplemental, as I said, we're playing Xi Jinping's game. And we're playing Putin's game, which is that our strength is being undermined, not from abroad, but from within.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to both Secretary Panetta and Secretary Pompeo, thank you for your extraordinary public service. It's good to see both of you again. Secretary Pompeo, I enjoyed visiting with you in Monterey with your son Jimmy and playing a little golf. Thank you for tolerating my bad golf with Ted Balistreri. Great to see you again. And Secretary Pompeo, thank you for, as Secretary of State, elevating this issue of the threat from China and establishing the deterrence that we need to continue to be vigilant about. I want to ask you about the recent APEC summit and your impressions of that. Following that Biden-Xi summit, the Biden administration removed the Chinese Ministry of Public Security's Institute of Forensic Science from the Commerce Entity List in exchange for greater cooperation on stopping the flow of fentanyl precursors that are being produced in the PRC. Last year, I questioned Assistant Secretary of State Crittenbrink on states' role in pressuring other agencies to delay implementation of sanctions and export controls. Secretary Pompeo, what kind of message does it send to our adversaries if the State Department intervenes to prevent the listing of PRC entities who should be sanctioned or subject to export controls?
Congressman Barr, I think that's an enormous policy mistake. I think it not only sends the wrong message, but I think the likelihood of Xi Jinping delaying precursors for fentanyl moving into our country is precisely zero as a result of that action. He has been determined to continue to poison our children here at home, and I don't think any action taken by the United States Department of State to sort of relieve them of any penalties, restrictions, prohibitions is likely to change his direction on that.
And just for context, this ministry that was removed from the Commerce Entity List, this is an instrumentality of the CCP that has engaged in horrendous genetic testing of Uyghurs and human rights violations. Secretary Panetta, you noted in your testimony that our adversaries routinely weaponize economic tools of market access and trade dependencies, such as fossil fuels from Russia and critical minerals from China. Last week, it was announced that in an effort to combat climate change, the Biden administration would be halting LNG exports. This administration, however, has extended 8 times a Treasury General license allowing for transactions involving Russian energy exports, including oil, to be exempt from U.S. sanctions. Do either of these actions, the action to block LNG exports to our allies in Eastern Europe, or the action to provide a general license to our sanctions regime against Putin, do either of those actions help us cut off funds from Moscow?
I don't know whether, and I hope they haven't, the administration has made a final decision with regards to LNG. I know the president has postponed that issue and is looking at some of the issues related to regulations, but I think it is very important to be able to provide that kind of fuel to our allies, for goodness sakes. Because they've joined with the United States, they have lost the ability to have to rely on Russian energy. That's a good thing, and we ought to be providing the support necessary in order to give them the ability to be independent of that source of energy. So I hope that the administration moves forward with the LNG and allows that fuel from the United States to be able to go to our allies.
Thank you. I agree with that. I think exporting energy, producing energy is a geopolitical tool, and it's a grave mistake to not recognize that. But in addition, I want to talk a little bit about, as a member of the Financial Services Committee with oversight over Treasury, the Treasury's Department's inexplicable decision to provide a license to Russian banks to allow them to process energy transactions. And I've spoken with Secretary Yellen about this. I've spoken to Wally Adeyemo. These are great public servants who are trying to do right with this oil price cap regime. But the problem is the oil price cap is not working. It's Russian crude is trading above the cap, and it's not enforceable. To me, what would make more sense is to sanction dirty, polluting Russian energy and produce more American energy to help our allies. Can either of you speak to that?
I think you made a very good point, and that's what we should be doing.
Well, I thank the gentlemen for their testimony and their service. And once again, Secretary Pompeo, thank you especially, or Secretary Panetta, thank you especially for your incredible work with the intelligence community in the lead up to the Abbottabad mission. That was some great patriotic work, and this country is eternally indebted to your leadership. I yield back.
Thank you. At some point, someone will play you in a movie too, Mr. Secretary Pompeo. Fear not.
I fear that's true.
Yeah. Mr. Kim is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the two of you for coming on out and talking to us here. Secretary Panetta, I'd like to start with you. I've been listening to your responses to some of these questions. You've had a couple of really great points I'd love to flesh out and bring out some more. You talked about deterrence. And the critical nature of two components there in terms of our military and our economic strength. But also you, in response to one of my colleagues, talked about the importance of sending a signal to the world that we're strong and the credibility that's there. And so I want to try to merge these together because, you know, when I had a conversation once with a leader from the Indo-Pacific region, you know, they were talking about, look, the American military strength is here. They're asking, you know, the United States is asking us to join that component. We're having these talks about economic strength, and yes, that's part of it. But what they pointed out was one thing. They said that the number one question that they talk about amongst themselves about what to do with the United States and China, and that other countries are talking about, is this singular question, which is America a reliable partner? And they said it to me in a way that they just said, we know the answer to that right now. You know, all the challenges that we see, domestic turmoil and other things like that. So I guess I wanted to ask you, you know, when you talk about deterrence with military and economic strength as these two pillars, would you be amenable to the idea of kind of adding a third pillar there of political strength too? Of showing that, you know, if you have the strong military, the strong economy, without that component of being able to have a government that can make decisions decisively, quickly, that it weakens the components of the other elements of deterrence. Is that something that makes sense to you?
No, it makes a great deal of sense. Look, what represents the power of the United States? Obviously, our military capability, our diplomatic capability, our economic strength, those are the strengths of the United States. But most important is the word of the United States, and whether we stand by our word, whether we are credible. And so when it appears that we are weak in the sense of delivering what we promised we would do, it hurts our credibility. I mean, I've been abroad, just like you have, and I've talked to foreign leaders. And the question that they inevitably ask is, what's happening in the United States? Yeah. Can we trust the president? Can we trust the Congress? Can we trust an ally? Those are the questions I get. And I'm sure others have gotten the same question.
Yeah, thank you.
And the important thing is that we have to show that what we say we will do, we do. And if we back away from that, it sends the wrong message to the world.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary. Secretary Pompeo, I'd love to kind of bring you into this, you know, the challenges that you see before us, the fact that two of you served here in Congress and you're seeing what we're up to, the challenges we're facing, this constant threat of a government shutdown that we just keep struggling with, this issues with the supplemental. I guess I wanted to ask your thoughts of what Secretary Panetta just said. You know, what is the importance of our ability to fix our own system and get our own house in order, show that the bipartisanship that we have here is something that can extend to 435 in the House and 100 in the Senate. I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yes, I lived the dream as well. Passed a handful of continuing resolutions on my watch too, much to the Department of Defense's consternation, right? We couldn't redirect our resources. The same was true during my time in the executive branch. I watched Congress unable to actually move resources to the current day challenges. As time moves on, one needs to be able to do that. Continuing resolutions prevent that. So I was a big advocate for trying to work through the appropriations process, get that done. But I'm also mindful these are serious matters, and there are differences in judgment and opinion. I don't mind the to and fro, the angst that people somehow describe. I'm unbothered by a rambunctious American democracy. That never troubles me. In the end, we have to deliver the policy prescriptions that get it right. I heard, maybe this is the first place we'll disagree, I heard Secretary Panetta speak earlier about deterrence in Ukraine and Xi Jinping. I think Xi Jinping saw what happened, an invasion of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine, and he is not suggesting that we should pat ourselves on the back in America, right? The one free bite at the apple killing tens of thousands of Ukrainians is not something that we should be proud of. We lost deterrence in Ukraine. We shouldn't applaud ourselves for rallying NATO. That's great. I'm glad the Europeans stood up. But we should remember that we did not conduct American foreign policy with the diplomatic excellence and the military power to actually convince Putin not to invade Ukraine. We have to win these things. It is insufficient to catch incoming missiles. Right? You have to hold your adversary at risk. And as we think about the CCP, this was my central theory. This was to what Congressman Barr said. My effort as Secretary of State was to remind the world that if we don't hold the CCP at risk, if we simply play defense economically, defense diplomatically, we allow a spy balloon to travel over our country for 5 days and then hold a press conference announcing what brilliance it was to shoot it down over South Carolina. Right? That Xi Jinping gets that he's on offense, we're on defense, and that is not a good place for the United States to be.
Thank you. Mr. Newhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretaries, welcome this morning. It's an honor to have you both here. And Mr. Panetta, just so you know, your son is honorably carrying on the tradition of public service. I guess the jury's out on it.
I appreciate that.
Should we take a poll?
Family affair.
Good. So peace through strength, that's something that we've lived with and have tried to exercise for many decades. And I think I agree with both your comments in that regard. We as a committee went through a tabletop exercise, some people call it a war game, to see what scenarios and outcomes would look like in the event of China moving on Taiwan. I heard someone say that it was a prevent war games because at the conclusion of that, no outcome was anything that anybody would like to see on both, I think on either side. The cost would be very high. One of the goals, I think, of many people is to have President Xi wake up every morning and think, today's not the day. That there are so many deterrents staring him in the face that he would come to that conclusion. And I think I've heard from Secretary Gates, Robert Gates, that no one in the Chinese military has experience on any kind of major war. No general has any war experience. And so there's a lot of reasons why maybe an invasion would not be their first course of action, which leads me to maybe a more probable course of action. I just returned from Japan recently, and the number of incursions in Taiwanese and Japanese airspace by aircraft from China is in the hundreds every year. The naval ships that, the presence of the Chinese Navy on the eastern coast of Taiwan is constant. So if an invasion, all-out invasion at cost is too high and too difficult, what can we do as a country to prevent or stop or deter China from taking an easier route, perhaps, of a blockade and simply just strangling Taiwan from outside any travel or anything coming into the country?
There is no question that The most important thing we can do with regards to Taiwan is to strengthen their deterrence and to not only provide the arms, but provide the training necessary for them to be able to defend themselves, and to show that the United States will maintain a presence in that area with our Navy and with our other capabilities. It's important to make clear to China that they aren't going to have a free ride if they decide to make trouble for Taiwan. But it is very important that if we say we will defend them militarily, that we defend them militarily. And that means providing whatever support they need if they are, in fact, a victim of aggression by China. The thing that Xi is going to constantly be looking at is whether or not we are taking actions. This is not about words. This is about actions. And what we do to support Taiwan and to maintain a strong presence in the South China Sea, those are the kinds of actions that Xi will watch very closely and be deterred by.
Thank you. Mr. Pompeo?
Just two thoughts. I agree with Secretary Panetta. Two thoughts. A blockade gets ugly really quickly. The difference between an invasion and blockade is a continuum, for sure. Once product ceases to flow out of Taiwan into the rest of the world, a country upon Taiwan is a country upon which the entire world is dependent daily for deliveries across the world. It gets difficult very quickly. It gets difficult for the Vietnamese, the Japanese, the Philippines, the Australians, even more quickly than it does for us here in the United States. And so we should not, I guess my urging is not to think about the blockade as a more peaceful or more genteel solution to Xi Jinping's desire to bring Taiwan under his political control, but an act of war very much in the same way that an invasion would be.
Thank you. Ms. Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of our witnesses. It's certainly quite significant to have both of you here testifying before our committee, and we thank you for your time. Mr. Pompeo, in your testimony, you talk about the economic war and the war that we have been in and maybe sometimes pretending we aren't in. Do you see economics as the primary motivation for the CCP to align itself with American adversaries and in many respects taunt us on the global stage, or are there other motivations?
Thank you for the question, and thanks for the kind words. You actually got 100% of the former Italian-American CIA directors here today, so quite an accomplishment.
And I joined the Italian caucus.
This is thank you for that. We appreciate it. No, I actually think their primary motivation is ideological. It is Xi Jinping is driven by a Marxist-Leninist ideology, a historic understanding of China as the middle kingdom of the central actor on the world stage, and he feels there is a that their history has been wronged by the Western order. And so economics is a tool by which he seeks to achieve the global hegemony that he so seeks, but I think the motivation is much deeper and much darker than just trying to figure out how to make a few more renminbi for his people. This is not an effort to improve life for the Chinese people. This is an effort for aggregation of power for the Chinese Communist Party.
And as we look towards maintaining the post-World War II order, as you described in your testimony, what does that look like in this 80-year mark that we're about to hit since the end of World War II, and with some of the changing dynamics that have hit the West, particularly with Brexit as an example, as well as the West's reliance on CCP investment in their economy? How do we bring along our European allies to this deterrent strategy, given that you're a former Secretary of State and not a former head of Treasury?
Goodness. So in the end, the central thesis is got two legs to it. One is respecting national sovereignty. Nation states acting in their own self-interest. We marked it as America first. I always reminded others, when I was in Asia, I would remind that, ma'am, you think Bangladesh should be first, you're running that country. Sovereign nations acting in their own interest. And then second, the United States has a deep interest in protecting basic freedoms and property rights and contractual capacity to deliver against increasing efforts to undermine market-based economies, right? This is one of the central theories of Xi Jinping is show up in Africa with some stolen intellectual property from the United States that you built with cheap labor inside of China and then dump it on the world in an effort to aggregate political power. We have a model that is deeply different from that. We should not head down that route, but we have to make sure that an increasing number of nations benefit from these central ideas of basic property rights, contracts, the capacity to engage in relationships in a way that protect basic human dignity as well.
And the use of American innovation as a place of strength, not to be exploited through those who do not necessarily share our goals for free and open capital markets success. And there's a lot to be said around this idea of how we maintain the post-World War II order and redefine it for the time period that we are in today, looking not only back to a great history that defined so much economic success for individuals, but also for the world. And we need to think very strategically about how we're working with our allies, particularly on supply chains and access to minerals. And Mr. Panetta, with just the slight remaining time, would love to get any thoughts you have about Iran and what the CCP's motivations are, particularly as we're facing another pressure with democracy being under attack with our friend Israel, as well as some of the impeding terrorist demands that are coming down.
Okay, I think you get it, and you understand where we really have to go in order to develop the strength of the United States and our allies in economic competition with China. China engages with Belt and Road initiatives. They engage in spreading a lot of money around. They engage in building ports and doing all kinds of things that pretend to help countries. But let me tell you, it doesn't work because countries feel like they are not the ones that are really benefiting from this. And that's why the United States needs to continue to show how we should promote economic justice.
Thank you. Dr. Dunn.
Thought I was a little farther down the line. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have several articles I'd like to enter first, and I'd like to enter those now, if I may. And I can read the names. 5 articles?
Without
no
objection.
From Afghanistan, Ukraine, Iran, Israel, the Biden administration has categorically failed they failed on foreign policy, they failed to deter war, the very first mission of diplomacy. From the disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan to the lack of guidance in Ukraine and delayed support for Israel, and now delayed responses on this drone attack on American servicemen in Jordan. It's all a failure of deterrence. And it's how much easier is it to fail when your U.S. president turns over $6 billion to Iran. The Iranian government is constantly working to destabilize the Middle East, and they pose a danger to our allies in the region. They're a known funder of terrorism, and they pose a direct threat to national security. We can't economically support them. Let me say, Mr. Secretaries, I've never said that before, Mr. Secretaries. Never before have we had a more august pair of experts on international policy before us. So thank you very much for being here. And Secretary Panetta, I wanted to thank you for your earlier comments about the willingness of our young men and women to defend America and the free world One of my sons served under you when you were SecDef in the Middle East in multiple tours, and I saw the same determination that you described. And I'll add everybody's telling you how well Jimmy's behaving. He's been outstanding. He's just terrific. He hasn't ever had a day when people said so many nice things about him. Secretary Pompeo, thank you very much for being here today and for your continued public service on foreign affairs and diplomatic policy, even in the face of Iranian death threats and bounties on your life. With all the separate attacks that we're seeing across the world, it can certainly look like our growing number of adversaries are acting independently, but I think we know that's not the case. There is this sort of global alliance against democracy, the rules-based order of nations. And our NATO allies actually have risen to this fact and declared their concerns in these other theaters, such as the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East. I wonder if you would clarify for us this threat to the free world for our folks back home, because it doesn't always, they don't always think about that in a larger sense.
So it is the case, as you've described. These are all linked. These are not independent strategies. They may be in independent theaters, separate theaters, but make no mistake about it. There are Iranian drones going to Russia to kill Ukrainian kids. There's Russian energy flowing to China. There's Chinese semiconductors flowing to the Russian defense industry. Iranian oil into both Russia and China. These actors are working to undermine the things that matter most to us here at home. It's hard sometimes when I represented South Central Kansas. It's hard to appreciate when you're going about your life, raising your family. It's hard to appreciate that there is evil in the world that is a staggering confrontation to our way of life as we find it. We always, in America, we try to find the best in people. We're always optimistic, but having spent time, as I know Secretary Panetta, with some of the most evil human beings that have ever walked the face of the earth during our lifetimes, these folks want bad things for us. They want to undermine that very idea of freedom here at home, and we have a responsibility to get it right economically, diplomatically, and make sure we have a strong military to defend those two.
Well, I agree with you greatly. I appreciate the both of you gentlemen lending your life of service and knowledge and insights to this committee. This committee has been behaving very, very bipartisan fashion. I think we all agree that we have a serious problem in front of us, and it's our job to rally our friends around us and our colleagues and support these things in the world. Thank you so much for coming here and shoring up our determination. I appreciate that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Auchincloss.
Mr. Chairman, this hearing is an opportunity to highlight the dangers of authoritarianism, not just abroad, but also the threats we face at home. In your testimony, Mr. Pompeo, you cite a lack of decency and respect for vital institutions in our own culture as a troubling sign for our nation's future, that a nation and society intent on despising and destroying itself will not prevail. It's a worthy message undercut by the record of its messenger. A messenger who cited the insurrection that occurred here on January 6th as an example of, quote, a peaceful transition of power. January 6, 2021 was Xi Jinping's best day in office. It aids its own democracy on the world stage for people all over to witness. It undermines our ability to lead and the power of our example. What kind of example are we setting when former administrations take the side of dictators? What kind of example are we setting when your former boss, the likely presidential nominee of your party, is promising to be a dictator? Mr. Pompeo, you write that, quote, regimes in Moscow, Tehran, Pyongyang, and Caracas all owe their continued existence to the Chinese Communist Party. You omit that prior to his invasion of Ukraine, you described Putin as, quote, very capable, end quote, and said you had, quote, enormous respect for him. Also missing from your remarks, these regimes have an ally in Donald Trump. Just this month, Donald Trump praised Kim Jong-un at a rally in New Hampshire, referring to him as, quote, a tough, smart guy. While in office, he considered meeting with Maduro and second-guessed his own administration's recognition of Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate president. He rejected his own intelligence agencies, including the CIA, which you were the director of at the time, on the world stage during his shameful Helsinki summit, and denied the evidence that Moscow interfered in our elections. On one thing, though, we do agree. Our democracy is stronger when we invest in and celebrate our free society. We have the tools to outcompete autocracies at home and abroad, but it's not just, as you say, a strong military and a strong economy. It's also a strong democracy. Secretary Panetta, you make this clear in your remarks. Quote, the greatest threat to national security is if we fail to govern our democracy. I agree with you. But Mr. Pompeo, this cannot happen if we defy reality and rewrite history for political expediency. So now, on behalf of your call for respect for vital institutions, will you here attest, now under oath, that Joe Biden was duly elected in a free and fair election?
Well, so much for bipartisanship of this committee. Well done, sir. You have destroyed that.
Will you attest under oath that Joe Biden was duly elected in a free and fair election, out of respect for the vital institutions of our democracy, as you write?
Yes, sir. I've spent my entire life, my time in service as a lieutenant and a captain in the United States Army, as a member of Congress.
Will you attest that Joe Biden won a free and fair election as the duly elected President of the United States?
Of course, President Biden is the duly elected President of the United States. But if you'll allow me to respond to your diatribe for a moment, sir, if you would permit that, that'd be most decent and bipartisan, institution respecting, if you would do that.
In a free and fair election?
May I just respond to the tirade that you engaged in?
Will you answer the yes or no question?
If you want to protect institutions, you would call witnesses and permit them to respond when you make assertions that are fundamentally unfounded and indecent, sir.
With the witness unwilling to respond to the question, we're going to assert that his answer was no. Mr. Panetta, if a Republican were to win in November, would you recognize that individual as the duly elected President of the United States? Of course. Is the right answer, Mr. Pompeo. I yield back.
I wish Secretary Clinton would. Secretary Clinton would be so clear about her election as well.
We have a minute and 10 seconds that I'll give to Secretary Pompeo to answer the question.
Just this. We did have a peaceful transition of power from the Trump administration to the Biden administration. I was present for that. I saw my State Department work diligently to deliver the information that Secretary Blinken desperately needed to get started on the right foot, and I have been proud to work alongside Secretary Blinken.
Mr. Chairman, reclaiming my
gentleman has yielded to me. I have given that time to Secretary Pompeo.
I'd like to see a show of hands who here thinks it was peaceful on January 6, 2021.
What are you doing?
The last thought, and by the way, I was happy that the State Department executed that tradition with such aplomb and such excellence. The second thought is this. Look, we'll have partisan disagreements on many things. I think it is a factual matter. You recounted a number of foreign policy. I think it's a factual matter that the world was in less conflict 3 years ago than it is today. Secretary Blinken just yesterday said that not since 1973 has the Middle East been so dangerous. I agree with him on that. It was safer 3 years ago because we had established a deterrence model that was successful at preventing invasion of Europe, the debacle in Afghanistan, the good work that we did. You'll recall that the Trump administration was the first administration to actually provide defensive weapon systems to Ukraine when the Obama administration had concluded it could not or would not do so. These were things that kept the American people safe. It wasn't partisan, it wasn't political, it was good policy.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretaries, thank you very much for being articulate and logical voices about the power of deterrence, about the importance of American leadership, and about the very real risk posed by this authoritarian alignment between China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and others. We've talked a lot about that authoritarian alignment of external actors. I'm curious, to what extent does that alignment extend to within our own borders? To what extent has the Chinese Communist Party identified and invested in partners that seek to undermine our country from within? And Mr. Pompeo, or rather Secretary Pompeo, we can, or yeah, go ahead, Mr. Panetta.
That was one of the great concerns we saw when I was director of the CIA. It was obvious that China had an extensive intelligence network at play, and that through their technology, they were deliberately planning methods of gathering intelligence, whether it was Huawei, or other sales, that they were using that for intelligence. They are very aggressive within the United States now on disinformation. We know that Putin waged a disinformation campaign as well. China's doing exactly the same thing, using artificial intelligence very effectively to spread disinformation and misinformation in this country. So that, I think, remains a significant concern, that at a time when, you know, they talk about dialogue and the time when they talk about trying to improve relations, we cannot underestimate their efforts to basically undermine our democracy.
I give just two quick thoughts, but I agree with Secretary Panetta that we should never forget this information space in social media and how the Chinese Communist Party has communist-directed entities that are on every one of our children's cell phones, passing information that is deeply filtered, designed for our young people here to undermine their idea and their understanding of America and our foundational ideas. We have to take serious action there. Second thought, you know, it seems like a long time ago, but don't forget, this is the very Xi Jinping that unleashed a virus upon the world, that killed millions of people, including over 1 million people in the United States. It gets seldom referenced. It's hard to imagine the staggering impact that COVID had on the world, and yet no one's held Xi Jinping accountable, not for the leak from his lab, which happened, but for the fact that once he was aware that he had a leak from his lab of a relatively lethal, relatively contagious virus, he foisted upon the world. He made a decision to hide the data, to hide the information, to off the researchers, and to put thousands of people on airplanes and transit them across the world with the death and destruction and the economic harm that followed from that. This is the very same Xi Jinping that is working here in the United States against us.
It's pretty well in the record of this committee that the algorithms of TikTok in America are designed to deliver trash to American youth. The algorithms in China deliver a more virtuous content. Because of that and other reasons, I have a tendency to describe TikTok as nothing more than CCP malware. Is that hyperbolic, or is that accurate?
No, I happen to think it's accurate.
It has to be fixed, and it's not. I would only add, it's not just TikTok. It's deeper. It's broader. It's more pervasive in the way that Secretary Panetta described it. And so this effort at information warfare is something, it's hard for democracies to defend because we have wide open societies. And I get that, and I'm happy about that. But we have to do it, and we have the tools to do it as well.
Well, go ahead, Secretary Panetta.
By the way, I think it also raises the importance of our ability to have good intelligence on China. We need good intelligence on our adversaries. We get intelligence even on our allies. But intelligence is critical to our ability to make the right decisions. And I have to tell you, China is a very tough target. And it's not easy to be able to penetrate and get the kind of intelligence that we absolutely need if we're going to deal with China.
Well, thank you, gentlemen. I fear that much of America is still sleepwalking through the very real threat that every single day China, Russia, and others have thousands of people and millions of dollars at work in undermining our country in the ways you described. Thank you for calling attention to that threat. With that, I yield.
Ms. Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretaries Pompeo and Panetta, for joining us today. The United States faces an array of threats around the world, the likes of which we have not seen in decades. It is clear U.S. global leadership is critical at a time when our competitors, like the Chinese Communist Party, are manufacturing strategic alliances to challenge us. However, there must be other ways to avoid a spiral of competition in which the CCP increasingly supports oppressive states like Russia, North Korea, and Iran, forcing us to respond. And as we know, conflict on the international stage can have impacts seen at the local level, including higher prices at the gas pumps and grocery stores and longer shipping times for U.S. consumers to get the goods they need. This is a cycle of ever greater conflict which we must break if we are to work together in the global community to solve our biggest challenges like climate change, migration, and nuclear proliferation. So, Secretary Panetta, since we cannot draw any of these hostile nations into our orbit, what can we do to break the cycle and disrupt the formation of CCP-led strategic alliances before they cement?
Look, I think we have to stand back and look at that dangerous world that's out there. and look at all the flashpoints that are part of that world and the threats coming from China, from Russia, from North Korea, from Iran, from terrorists. It is a troublesome world. And I often think, how does the United States confront that many challenges? The only way we can confront those challenges is through building alliances. That's the only way we're going to be able to deal with it. It has to be not only the United States, but it has to be our allies. And by the way, the one thing about these autocrats is they're not very good at alliances. They're not very good at building their own alliances. That's our advantage. So we need to strengthen NATO. We need to strengthen our relationship with both Israel and moderate Arab nations in the Middle East. We need to strengthen our relationship in the Pacific between Japan, South Korea, Australia, India, the Quad. We need to build those relationships. We need to do it in Latin and Central America, and we need to do it in Africa. That, I think, is going to be the most fundamental task, is how we effectively build those alliances so that we can confront these adversaries with our allies.
And while we aim for a more productive global community, we must continue to operate in the reality of these times. I am clear-eyed on the need for the U.S. to remain a steady, solid, and sound defender of the rules-based international order. When democracies anywhere are threatened, whether Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan, it is our moral duty to step up and lend a helping hand. President Biden has led the world in support for democracies under threat, like Ukraine and Israel, but Congress needs to do more to provide the resources the president requested in his National Security Emergency Supplemental. Without these essential resources, our allies would be left in the cold. Secretary Panetta, what would you say are the most critical pieces of President Biden's National Security Supplemental request, particularly with regards to Taiwan?
Look, I think that supplemental is a very important request that will benefit our foreign policy in the world. Our ability to provide military aid to Ukraine. We've delayed this for too long, and Ukraine has suffered as a result of that. And the last damn thing we want is to give Putin an advantage in Ukraine. So that is extremely important. Aid to Israel, we know how important that is in order to give them the capability they need in order to defend themselves. And Taiwan, obviously, another democracy that is under threat. So every one of those pieces that are critical to the supplemental, I think the president has obviously made that request, but very frankly, I think the bipartisan support in the Congress is there to pass that package. We just need to get there. And I understand that we need a deal, and I understand we need to protect our border as well. All of that is critical, though, to being able to show the world that the United States stands by our word.
And thank you. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. 11 a.m. is a hard stop. The math doesn't currently work out if everybody stays here, but we're going to power through and get as many done up to 11. Ms. Hinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, gentlemen. Thank you both for being here and for your service to our country and for sharing your insights so our committee can do this very important work. It's obviously hugely challenging hearing about the lengths that the PRC will go to continue to undermine us. They are aligned against us for their agenda, which is to spread their authoritarian regime, not just through China and suppress the Chinese people, but continue to do this around the world. So obviously very concerning. While they care deeply about their surveillance state globally, they care about spreading that influence through the debt trap diplomacy, as I've heard you both reference, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative and the initiatives that they have tried to use to undermine and overpower. These partnerships and relationships really, as we know, are really nothing more than an attempt to spread their authoritarian regime around the world and to undermine us in that process. So I want to focus on BRICS and the relationships there. Obviously, they have opened up BRICS to OPEC countries, and so when we talk about energy, and the vulnerabilities that exist there, with UAE, Iran, Saudi Arabia. How concerning is it that that bloc will really control the lion's share of oil production in the world, and what do you think that means for the United States and what our next steps need to be? That's directed at either of you, so.
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman Hinson. The United States is the swing producer for energy in the world, if we permit it to be so. Secretary Panetta said I think it's an enormous mistake to even pause the production of LNG or the export of LNG, because that will cause downstream. The capital markets will stop underwriting LNG production and we will have a gap. The United States should remain that. If we do that, if we continue to produce, we will be the producer of choice, and we will be the swing producer on price. Second, we're also an enormous consumer of energy as well. And so those countries that think they can form markets to the exclusion of U.S. consumers, U.S. industrial consumers and retail consumers, I think they're making a mistake, because we also drive price from the demand end as well. And so they're gonna do what they're gonna do. The last thing I'll say about that is, remember, those alliances form more strongly when our allies don't have confidence that the United States stands with them. When you tell the leader of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia that he is a pariah, he is more likely to choose to align himself with our adversaries than he is with the United States. Those are fundamental errors in understanding how these nations operate, and we should never take for granted what Secretary Panetta said, which is that we have the capacity to build alliances out that will deliver good things for the American people. And if we get that piece right, America will be in a much better, stronger position.
Do you have anything to add, Secretary Panetta?
No, I agree with what Mike said. It is, we have, in dealing with this challenge from autocracy in the world, we have several areas that represent the strength of the United States. Our military power, our diplomatic power, our economic power, and our energy power. All are critical to our ability to be able to deal with these challenges that we're facing in the world. So on energy, it just seems to me extremely important that the alliances we build in order to make sure that we are developing an independent source of energy, and that we are working towards the ability to undermine Russia's ability and Iran's ability to control that area. Mm-hmm. Imagine if we could get our act together on energy, how effective that would be in undermining those countries.
Yeah, we say in Iowa, all of the above, energy strategy and all of the below. So we're trying to do a little bit of everything. I think when you look at their strategy for BRICS and then you combine that with their strategy with Belt and Road, obviously you look at that debt trap diplomacy and what they've been able to do in South America. You talked a little bit about the instability there and potentially the war closer to home, Mr. Secretary, as well as what we've seen with kind of these unfulfilled loans and investments and China's ability to call on that capital. What do you think the United States' role needs to be in countering that? I just met with DJ Nordquist this morning to talk about, the World Bank and how our financial situation and how China's trying to grow influence there. So they're trying to pull these levers everywhere they're operating. What do you think our next step needs to be?
I don't have much time, but let me just say one thing. When you mentioned the World Bank and our role in these things, we should never mistake our desire for the global system to work for reliance on these international organizations. My experience as Secretary of State was the UN was a wreck, that the World Bank was largely Chinese influenced. These institutions, these historic, a World Health Organization during the time of COVID, I could go on and on and on. We sometimes in America think international, therefore existing structures and frameworks. We should revisit each of those. If they are not functioning in a way that delivers for America, we should evaluate America's continued participation in each of those institutions.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you so much, Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you both. Good to see you again. Given PRC's economic interests and global motivations, what should we be doing in terms of watching China's expansion and their footprint in Africa?
Yeah, look, having visited Africa and seen it up close, there's no question in my mind that wherever you go, China is present. They're investing in Africa. Their Belt and Road Initiative is being implemented in Africa. They're developing ports. They're developing infrastructure. And the end result of it, and make no mistake about it, everything they're providing is not to try to help those countries develop independence and develop their own economic strength. It's to basically undermine it and do it in order for China to benefit from that. If there are minerals there, they're going to take advantage of those minerals. If there are other assets there, they're going to take advantage of those assets. They're in it for their own game. And that's where I think the United States and our allies have to play a much more critical role to show African countries that we are there to help their people, not to help us.
I'd add, it's good to see you again, Congressman Carson. I'd only add this. In this sense, I think time is on our side a bit. My observation and that of my team when I was a Secretary of State was that many of these countries are beginning to see the folly of having taken so much resource and money from the Chinese Communist Party. It felt good in the moment, but they are now coming to appreciate what Secretary Panetta said, that they now have lost political power, political capacity, and that has constrained them, and that hurts them in terms of continuing to be able to represent their people and get good outcomes. It means we have to be more active. I tried to get the State Department to do better so that the West could compete in those places. I think we made a little bit of progress, a lot more work to do, but I think as time marches on, if we continue our efforts in the way that Secretary Panetta described, that ultimately the norms that we have come to believe in the West will be ones that Africa will largely adopt as well. I hope I'm right about that, and I think that I am.
Mr. Hood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank both of you for your tremendous service to our country, your commitment and dedication to what you've done to help make us a better country and a safer country. And I think it sends a strong message in a bipartisan way that both of you are here today and the message that you're sending. So grateful for that. I wanted to, this committee has focused on a number of different things over the last year. One is exposing the malign activities of the CCP that I think we've done a good job in doing. The second thing is figuring out how do we win the strategic competition against China. And in my view, winning that on the economic front is key to the future on how we do that. Going back over 20 years ago when we allowed China into the World Trade Organization, that seems to be a pivotal moment in this country. The argument at the time, none of us, I think, were in Congress then, but the argument was bring China into the World Trade Organization. They're going to modernize. They're going to liberalize. Their economy is going to become more like us. They're going to be part of the world global order. Clearly, that didn't work out the way that many of us thought it would. They play by a different set of rules, different set of standards. They're deceitful in many ways, steal intellectual property. And so here we are today having to deal with that. But we also have the reality that we have the two largest economic powers in the world. I think about my own district, probably similar to yours, Secretary Pompeo, corn and soybeans. 40% goes to China every year. My farmers need to rely on that market to do it. Take your Fortune 200 companies that are heavily invested in China. They're in bed in many ways with the CCP in terms of their business there. I have the largest concentration of Caterpillar workers anywhere in the world. CAT has 29 manufacturing plants in China, 4 R&D facilities there, and you can take any company and look at that. So when we think about how do we win the strategic competition against China, it's tough because it's our people in this country willing to take the economic hit that may be required. And many of us here in Congress want to go to a Cold War mentality with China on an economic front. And so we hear constantly from the BRT, the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce companies that are in China saying, well, maybe you guys ought to hold off, pump the brakes, be careful about what you're doing. I'm curious, as we think about how we win the strategic competition economically, your advice on that.
I'll give you 2 thoughts. First, one, not fault those businesses for their activities there as a historic matter. We encouraged them to go there. This was, in fact, the model that you described from the accession to the World Trade Organization. Go there, be there, they'll become more like us. It just epically failed. It didn't work. It may have been reasonable at the time. What's that mean for Kansas farmers and for manufacturers across America who depend on it? It means two things. One, don't count on the fact that it will be a U.S. policy decision that drives them out of the country. We can see this already today. Executives being detained, products not being permitted to move. The Chinese Communist Party will have a say in the level of disconnection between our two economies, and I think Xi Jinping is intent upon making his country more self-reliant. So I would urge those leaders of those businesses to be thinking about alternative markets and how you de-risk your balance sheet from a presence in China today, and doing so immediately. The second piece is, and this is the policy role, we need to be clear about those things that are legal and illegal. It is difficult for business leaders when we tell them, oh, you ought not do that, but it is lawful. I promise you the Chinese Communist Party is telling them what is illegal inside of their country, and it is becoming more difficult, more punitive, and harder for them to operate in both of those environments. You, policymakers, have the responsibility to say, if you really want this disconnection, if you really want certain elements of supply chain moved, if you want them done, then we need to put a legal regime in place, and I promise you, the American economy will prosper, we will prevail. The Chinese Communist Party is far more dependent on America than we are on them, and we ought to use that to our advantage.
Thank you. Secretary Panetta.
Yeah, look, I agree with what Mike said. There are two important areas here. One is the competition in the economy, and there's nobody better at competition than the United States. Our farmers, our manufacturers, our businessmen, I mean, we know how to get it done. Innovation, creativity, that goes to the strength of our economy. So I think it is very important for the United States to be able to unleash that kind of creativity and capability. And too often we try to restrict it because of various rules, et cetera. We ought to be enhancing the freedom of our economy in order to allow people to compete and to develop the kind of products that sell in the world. Secondly, in dealing with China, I mean, look, I'm a believer in free trade, but I'm also a believer in fair trade. And the problem with China is, you know, we engage in trade, but they don't believe in fair trade in the way they operate. And what we have to do is we've got to be able to put, and you did it with your recommendations on the economy. I think they're great recommendations. You got 152 recommendations. They're all right on point. And one of those is making sure that we take the WTO and make certain that the WTO is strong enough to be able to say to China when it engages in unfair trade, that's what you're doing, and you're going to be penalized for that.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Torres.
Secretary Panetta, you and I share belief in American leadership. We share belief that America, for all its imperfections, is on balance a force for good in the world, and that America plays an indispensable role as the leader of the free world and the enforcer of the rules-based international order, and that the alternative, a world shaped in the totalitarian image of the CCP, is too terrifying to imagine. But that basic belief in the benignity and necessity of America's global leadership, which is the raison d'etre of the China Committee, has been eroding not only abroad but here at home, where we are witnessing the rise of isolationism on both the left and the right. And so America as a democracy, constrained as it should be by the consent of the governed, is American global leadership politically sustainable in the long run if American sentiment here at home takes a decidedly isolationist turn, as it did in the aftermath of World War I?
Yeah, look, we made that mistake before. Before World War II, this country decided that somehow it could be isolationist and not have to get involved in dealing with the challenges and the threats abroad. We learned our lesson. I hope we learned our lesson, which is that you can't put your head in the sand. In a global world, it's even more so. The United States has to be out there, has to be dealing with our allies, has to be developing relationships with those that agree with the goals that we seek. We have to be engaged with the world. We cannot just simply pull back and pretend that somehow we can escape our responsibilities in the world and just somehow focus on issues here in the United States. Yes, we have to be concerned about the United States. Yes, we have to be concerned about our economy. But we also have to be concerned about our role in the world. The United States has to be a world leader. If there's any lesson we learned from World War II, is that the United States is a world leader. And let me tell you something. If the United States is not a world leader, nobody else will play that role.
In your testimony, Secretary Panetta, you said that America needs to send a message that it stands by our allies, but Congress itself has sent nothing but mixed messaging. Even though there's overwhelming bipartisan bicameral support for Israel and Taiwan, there has been an indefinite delay in delivering aid to both countries. Congress fails to act not only when Democrats and Republicans disagree, we fail to act even when we agree. And if there were standalone bills on Israel and Taiwan with no poison pills, both bills would pass overwhelmingly in both chambers of Congress. And so given the risk that negotiations around Ukraine and immigration could languish indefinitely, do you believe that it might be necessary at some point to decouple Israel and Taiwan from the larger negotiations in order to pass them immediately as standalone bills?
Well, look, as a former member of Congress, I said in my over 50 years of public life, I've seen Washington at its best, and I've seen Washington at its worst. The good news is I've seen Washington work. The reason I said I had the best job in the world as a member of Congress is because Republicans and Democrats, when I was here, worked together. We worked together and we got things done. We had good relationships. And when an issue like aid to a foreign country came around, we worked together. Look, I understand that politics is involved. I understand that there's the give and take. I mean, that's what democracy is all about. And I understand that dynamic. But in the end, it isn't about scoring political points. It's about governing. You guys aren't elected to come back here and pound your shoe on the table. You're elected to come back here and govern. That's what people elect you for. And for that reason, ultimately, people who of goodwill need to sit down, develop whatever deal they can develop, and get it passed. And if they can't get a deal, then there is no question that they have got to move Ukraine aid, Israel aid, and Taiwan aid on its own.
And I guess I have 10 seconds left. Do you feel China is emboldened by Donald Trump's America First isolationism or deterred by it?
Look,
Was that for me?
Oh, that's
Gentleman's time has expired, and we were trying to hit the 11 o'clock deadline. Mr. Banks is recognized.
Secretary Pompeo, I'm not sure the world has ever experienced...
Questions for the record will be considered.
Secretary Pompeo, I'm not sure the world has ever experienced the American foreign policy whiplash from peace through strength, the swagger of the Trump-Pompeo approach, to the weakness and appeasement that we see coming from the current administration. Why did Putin wait for you and President Trump to leave office before he invaded Ukraine?
It's good to see you again. Look, I try to take a fact-based approach to these things. I often get asked, would these things have happened if you all were still there? I avoid answering those. I can only articulate that they did not. I can only articulate that Putin decided that it was not a wise time to invade Ukraine while we were there, and then shortly thereafter began to continue his effort to take more of Ukraine. He took a fifth of Ukraine under President Obama, 0% during our time, and then went at it again. In the end, Putin didn't change. Putin's been the same guy since he was a young KGB officer. His desire for greater Russia is deep and embedded in his DNA. The only thing that stops these bad actors from roaming free around the world is an America prepared to respond in a way that puts more costs on them than the benefits of action.
So fast forward, last weekend, 3 of our American heroes were killed by a drone operated by the Houthis. What would have been the swift, appropriate reaction to hold those accountable for killing our American heroes?
It's hard to know, Congressman, exactly the response at an operational level that we would have taken. deterrence is always temporary. It's one of the things I reminded everyone in the administration. When you have deterrence for a moment, you can squander it so quickly. And frankly, that's what has happened. We've lost that moment. By the way, we had risk too. There were rounds fired at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad when I was a Secretary of State. We armed the damn thing to the teeth to protect our young men and women who were there, military and diplomatic women that were in that facility. And then when we were beginning to have deterrence slip, we took a strike on General Soleimani that restored that very deterrence for a time, for a period. I think the Trump administration would have recognized long ago, this would have been before October 7th, that you can't negotiate with the Ayatollah. You can't release sanctions and allow them to grow their foreign exchange reserves from $4 billion to over $50 or $60 billion. That money will be used for terror, and this is now the risk that we have in the escalations taking place as a result of the United States and our allies and partners having lost that deterrent capability, and will.
Secretary Pompeo, you notably warned our nation's governors about not getting too entwined and entangled with the Chinese Communist Party, as many of them did. As Washington becomes more aware of the China threat, the CCP has targeted many of our state's governors. This morning, the Washington Post published a story about the CCP's United Front efforts amping up their engagement with our nation's mayors, including the mayor of Carmel, Indiana, in my state, the former mayor, he just left office, who went on lavish trips to China and engaged at a high level with Chinese officials in their country. Why should our nation's mayors stray away from these types of entanglements with the sister cities projects and other CCP United Front efforts?
You know, Congressman Banks, it's in some ways parallel to what we were talking about in Africa, right? The Chinese Communist Party will always show up at people's doors with things that feel good. The remarks I made to the National Governors Association, I had to run through a State Department roadblock to make those remarks. It was hard for even the State Department to see this threat, not just at the federal level, but this was to a series of governors. And I now remind people, the Chinese Communist Party is showing up at school board meetings. They're showing up at city council meetings and county commission meetings all across America. In your state, Chairman Gallagher, in Wisconsin, they made a hard play for your state legislative body. They are determined to propagate their efforts. They want to make friends so that when they're confronted, they can turn to their friends and say, we're not such bad guys after all. The Chinese Communist Party is truly evil. They will work at every level of government. They will work against our private sector as well. They'll show up at PTA meetings if that's what it takes. This is an effort at every level for the Chinese Communist Party to have a capacity to influence our government.
Can you expand on why the sister cities program is so dangerous?
When the Chinese Communist Party shows up at your school and offers a free swing set, it is not because they care about the health of your children. That's maybe the simplest way to articulate sister cities programs and the Confucius Institutes and all of these United Front efforts inside of our country. They may show up and give you some temporary lift, but in the end, it is about them, not about us.
Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Secretary Panetta and Secretary Pompeo, for your service to our country. As you know, we hollowed out a lot of our manufacturing in this country, and a lot of it went to China. China has a massive trade deficit. We still have a massive trade deficit with China, and China has trade surpluses with Japan, with South Korea, with India, engaged in unfair economic competition. Would you think it's reasonable for the United States to explicitly have a goal to try to reduce the trade deficit with China by 10% every year, or some metric, so that we can rebalance the relationship?
I think it is very important for the United States to be able to develop industry, manufacturing, develop those products that are important, particularly to our national security. And you're right, we've hollowed out that capability over the last few years. We need to be able to make clear that we are going to develop the kind of security that we need. And yeah, I think limits make sense as part of that package of developing our own capabilities and manufacturing and industry.
Secretary Pompeo?
Yeah, I'd add, seems largely right. I'd add only this. We should begin the focus on things that really matter as opposed to trade more generally. I'm happy to think our way through that, but the initial problem set is at the dual-use technologies, AI, all of the places where the next generation of American manufacturing will actually evolve from, right? The manufacturer, I ran a machine shop in Wichita, Kansas, probably the only Secretary of State with that in his background of even for the next 250 years. In the end, we ran machines, we were good, but in the end it was technology innovation and the intellectual property against which we were building those manufactured goods, which were most important to the workforce and my capacity to grow my business. And I think that's true today. We ought to make sure we protect those things. And we can get that right as a policy matter, pretty straightforward. And I've watched as you all have tried to tackle that, and I hope you all can make even more progress there.
One of the things that I'm working on a bipartisan basis is seeing how we can have steel, and clean steel in particular, returned to the United States. I mean, hollowed out in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, Warren, Ohio, Downriver, Michigan. Keith Crotch, who worked for you, Secretary Pompeo, was one of the originators of the Chips and Science Act. I mean, that I give him credit, even as we worked with Todd Young and Chairman Gallagher was in an earlier part of the Endless Frontiers. And we did that for chips. Can we do that for steel, which is to say the next generation of steel, which is going to be direct reduction impact in Toledo or hydrogen? Why can't we lead in something like that and have the government partner with the Cleveland Cliffs on an issue like that, like we did for chips? I mean, we went from the largest exporter of steel, now 9 out of the 15 biggest steel companies are in China. So one, would you support a chips-like approach to new modern steel plants in the United States? And second, if you could just add, since then I'll give you the rest of the time, I don't understand how we're even thinking of letting Nippon Steel buy U.S. steel. I mean, Japan would never let us buy one of their steel plants. I mean, why is this even a question?
I guess I'll start with the second one and then the first one. I actually encourage foreign direct investment in the United States. I think it's incredibly important. It has created thousands and thousands of jobs in my hometown of Wichita, Kansas. Foreign companies who say, Japanese, European companies who want to come invest in America and create jobs. South Koreans now investing enormous amounts of money in Texas to build semiconductor fab. I think we should be enormously supportive of foreign direct investment when it wants to come here on American terms, and these are our friends and allies. Second, I did support the Chips and Science Act. It was with a touch of reluctance in my heart, but it was between Secretary Ross and myself and our two teams. And by the way, Secretary Raimondo has been fantastic on this. I credit the Biden administration for this. This was a set of technologies that mattered, and we had none of it here at home. I think that's the quintessential model for when someone needs to use American taxpayer dollars as a form of industrial policy. I think we need to be very careful about how and when we do that. And I prefer competition as the model, but when the competition is unfair and capital markets won't support an important technology for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, then I think we can do that. And if someone could make the case that steel were so, I'd support it. I wonder if those industrial metals don't end up, if you put a tariff on them or a tax on them, if it doesn't end up costing the American industry more than it gains them.
Gentlemen's time expired. We have 4 minutes to do Molinar, Whitman, and Steele. The Congresswoman, not Steele. We can do it. We're going to lead off with Molinar. And
all right, gentlemen, thank you, and I will be very quick. Appreciate your service. There is a Chinese company building an electric vehicle battery plant in my district. As part of the project, they plan to bring 20 to 50 Chinese nationals to Michigan. What do you feel are the odds of those nationals may engage in espionage for the CCP while they're in the United States? I know you've both been involved in looking at these kinds of things. Secretary Pompeo, you were issuing work visas to Chinese nationals as part of the State Department. I wondered if you'd both comment on that.
Look, I don't think there's any question that they're going to take advantage of that situation, and I think we have to be very vigilant about what the hell's going on. That's just the way they operate. They'll establish a manufacturing unit, they'll establish whatever they can, and then they will use that for their own intelligence purposes, they will use that for their own economic purposes, they'll use it to be able to gain the kind of advantages that they want that are counter, frankly, to the interests of the United States. I think it is very important in those situations to make sure that that the United States and that our intelligence capabilities are being used to make sure that we know what they are doing that could hurt the United States.
I think it is worse than the fact that they will engage in espionage. I think that's just top of the list. They will use this in ways that will leverage Chinese advantage. These plans are deeply dangerous to our national security and ought not be built.
Thank you. And then one last question. One of the concerns, you've talked about the Belt and Road initiatives, China spreading money around. One of the concerns I've had is in some of our, like in the Inflation Reduction Act, we provide green energy tax credits. This company would actually likely be applying for a green energy tax credit, so we could actually be supplying American taxpayer dollars to fund this project. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I'm against it. Trying to be quick. Thank you. By the way, it's not just that. You cite a good example, a marquee example, one that's been very public. There are dozens of these taking place, and I promise you the Chinese Communist Party is not subsidizing American companies that are acting in America's interests inside of China that benefit the United States of America.
Thank you. Secretary Panetta?
Look, I think we have to obviously be innovative in the way we use economic assistance, but we also have to be careful in the way we do it. And I think if we're going to provide funds, we better make damn sure they're not being used for purposes that undermine our national security.
Great.
Thank you both very much. I yield back, Mr.
Mr. Whitman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Panetta, thanks again for your service to our nation. You both have had extensive experience as cabinet members in dealing with the CCP. So you have that direct experience, and you see where things are today. Tell us, what is the most significant change that you have seen with the CCP? And do you think today that Xi Jinping and the CCP are more likely or less likely to take decisive action to reunify Taiwan?
Briefly, please.
As I mentioned in my testimony, I've visited with Xi a number of times when I was both director as well as Secretary of Defense. And at the time, I remember one conversation where he was being critical that we were rebalancing our force to the Pacific. And I said, look, we're a Pacific power. We have every right to have a presence in the Pacific. What you ought to be interested in is what you can do to work with us to deal with North Korea, to deal with the problems of trade, to deal with the problems of a free sea approach to trafficking and to our Navy. And he said something about, yeah, if we could work together, we could develop peace and prosperity. That was the Xi that I saw, but he's changed. There's no question about it. We could talk about the reasons. There are a lot of reasons why it's happened, but there's no question in my mind that Xi has been cornered in a number of ways, both in the way he dealt with COVID as well as the way he's dealing with his economy. There is one fundamental focus that Xi has. It's on China. It's on China. And his problem right now is that China is eroding from under him. And I think that makes him more dangerous, not less.
I'd concur. Secretary Panetta dealt with a very different Xi Jinping than we dealt with. Over time, he changed, his objective changed. He accreted more power, I think, gave him more freedom to move, and I think it's much more likely that he will continue his, if not militarily, his political efforts to bring political control to Taiwan.
Quickly, Ms. Steele.
Chairman.
We've hurt U.S. Steel here. Go ahead.
Both secretaries came from California, and especially for Secretary Pompeo, you actually came from my district, city of Fountain Valley, and thank you for coming out today. I wish I have a little time, but you know what, since I'm a junior member, and you know what, don't have time, but I just want to say thank you.
Great. We appreciate that. Thank you to both of our witnesses in what was almost a perfect hearing, but graded against the curve of Congress. We're still doing pretty well. And questions for the record are due 1 week from today. And with that, the committee is adjourned. No selfies with the witnesses. They got to go.